Well, welcome to another week of Global Christian Perspectives. I'm Elgin Hushbeck, your host, and this week we've got a lot of interesting topics, I hope, and a lot of probably a little bit of controversy coming forward. And as usual, we're joined by Chris Eyre and Allan Bevere, and we're also joined by Michael. What is your last name again?
Kennedy.
Michael Kennedy. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry.
That's good.
Starting off with my brain freezing. Anyway, our first topic this week is the President's announcement to keep troops in Afghanistan past the end of his term. This is fairly significant. One of the big things he campaigned on was to bring troops out of Iraq and Afghanistan before the end of his terms. And so in some respects, this is breaking a campaign promise. And as a normal opponent of the president, I would want to say this is something I actually agree with, and I don't fault him at all. I think it's essentially looking at reality. But let's just pass this off to the group. Chris from England, how do you view this?
I think, frankly, given the situation, he's being sensible, and I'm glad to see him not clinging at all costs to policy promises he's made. I mean, to some extent, it's a not my circus, not my monkeys, because I don't get to support or not support Obama, and from my point of view, he's far too right-wing. But I think it's a sensible step to take. Yes.
Allan?
Well, sure. I mean, I think I'm one who thinks that since 2003 we've made a mess over there, big time. And I think if you're going to make the mess, I think that you need to stay and make sure it gets cleaned up. You have no choice. And so I think he is right to listen to his generals. I do agree that you also listen to your generals as far as the number of troops, which I know he has cut in half from the recommendation. But our experience has been in this century, in the 20th century, is that the generals tend to be the ones who are most hesitant to go to war, as opposed to the politicians. So I think if you're going to do this, get it done and do it right. And so I think it was the right decision.
Michael?
I don't. I'm not surprised by the announcement. I don't think there was any other option, to be honest with you. I do think it's interesting too, though, to think about and realize that regardless of where the United States has been in the 20th century, we remain have some type of presence still in those locations. So if you look at Vietnam, if you look at Korea, you look at Germany. You look at those locations, we still maintain a presence there through military bases and things like that. So the idea that at some point we're going to be able to pull completely out of Afghanistan or Iraq is probably not going to happen, just based on where we find ourselves, even in other locations where the United States military has been in operation in the 20th century. So
I would correct that a little bit. We did leave Vietnam, which was without leaving a presence, which was one of the factors between the boat people in Cambodia and the millions that died there. So I do think we have a pattern where we've stayed in Korea, we stayed still in Germany, we stayed in Japan up until we were literally no longer needed. So where we've stayed, things have turned out pretty good. We left in Vietnam and we left in Iraq, and those places had turned out pretty badly, although Vietnam has turned itself around and is not too bad now. But the only downside I would say was I do think we should listen to our generals. I think the president's strategy, or president's position, is to set the strategy, set the goals. Well, I think you should leave it to your commanders to determine troop levels and the needs. And too few troops just means it's harder to do the job, and more people die ultimately. And if you don't have enough, you could actually even fail. So, but still, I want to take the opportunity to agree with the president, because I don't get to do that very often. So I do want to agree with him where I can. Let's move on to our next topic, government mental health. And this is one that comes out of the shootings, and one of the things that we've seen in a pattern is that a lot of the shooters have had mental issues, and that has seemed to be either on medication or not reported by some of the laws. People had known there was problems but were forbidden to report them or to put the pieces of the puzzle together. And Congressman Tim Murphy has a bill in Congress. He's been working on this issue for several years and has put together a bill to try and address some of the problems. One of the interesting statistics that I saw in his article was that in 1955 we had roughly 550,000 inpatient psychiatric beds, places for people who had problems. Today, with a much bigger population, that's actually surprisingly dropped down to 45,000, which I thought was a pretty shocking figure. And on the other hand, we have 211 federal programs dealing with mental health, and obviously they're not doing a very good job. So let's get some of your comments on that. Would mental health be a better place to focus than on gun control, or definitely just do we have a mental health problem? Allan, why don't we start with you this time?
Well, I mean, I think the question of gun regulation is still on the table in that debate. I think I don't think that's a deflection of the issue. However, having said that, since the focus here is on mental health, I do agree. I think that there are two problems that we have faced. One is that we place a lot of emphasis on the right of the individual, so it's very difficult to commit anyone to any kind of psychiatric treatment unless they have, as I think we were talking before we went on air, is that they have to demonstrate they're a danger to themselves and to others. Well, you almost can't do that until they've already done the deed, and that's one problem. And then the other thing is the cutting of funding. And I deal with homeless people all the time who have mental health issues that are not being treated, and they're just not going to function in society, and for various reasons. So I do think the mental health component of the violence we have experienced is definitely a real issue. It should be addressed.
Chris, you have similar problems in England?
Frankly, yes. The mental health system is barely able to cope, probably not really able to cope, unless somebody is hospitalizable on an immediate basis. They tend to have to wait maybe 2 years for treatment. And we also have the care in the community priority, which basically means that most people are going to be trying to fend for themselves in the community. A lot of them end up in our prison system for obvious reasons. The one thing I think I want to say is that I know we're not concentrating on the gun issue, but on the statistics I see, about a quarter of the population are going to go through a significant psychological or psychiatric illness at some point during their lives. And I will say that both my wife and myself are among the quarter on that. It's going to be very easy to find that someone has had some problems of that kind, and I wouldn't want that to divert from the gun control issue. That said, I volunteer with our local mental health trust. They are stretched to beyond breaking point, and there are going to be some people who commit offences because they're not in a hospital as a result. Yeah.
Michael.
Yeah, I was when Chris mentioned that about the persons with mental health issues ending up in the prison system. I pulled this up just here in the United States based on the National Institute of Corrections said in 2006, which is the latest study that they've been able to do, that in the state prisons within the United States, there were a little over 700,000 mentally ill adults, right at 80,000 in federal prisons, and about 480,000 in local jails. So it does seem as if the numbers have come down on mental health institutions, but have risen pretty dramatically in the prison system. So definitely think maybe an option of looking at how to treat that within the prison system, if that's where they're seeming to land at this point in time, maybe an option of being able to do some of that. So, but definitely a major issue that has to be addressed, and I think the stigma that our society has placed on mental health issues, that people are afraid when they're walking through difficulties, such as that, to feel like they have a voice to be able to say what's going on without fear of somebody turning them in, for instance, or trying to commit them or something like that. I mean, I think that's something that people need, if nothing else, education about this issue of mental health disease and what can be done, what is offered in terms of services, and how people can get the help that they need. So,
yeah, I think one of the problems is, I think there's two problems here. One is how do you balance the rights of the individual? I guess back in the 60s and the 70s, it was a big big movement to empower the individuals. Evidently, we were, in theory, locking up a lot of people who didn't really need to be locked up. I seem to actually remember a couple of movies about that or something, where you get somebody institutionalized to get rid of them with the help of some evil doctor. Although, frankly, I don't think that's actually a realistic fear. I think the other aspect of this is we kept talking about mental health, but it's really a very wide problem. Someone who has severe mental health problems is not the same as someone who has depression for a short period of time. And yet we tend to lump all those together, which I think may be part of the stigma is, it's sort of this in the medical world. If every time we mentioned something, disease, all we talked about was cancer, whether they had a cold or whether they had cancer. We treated it the same way. We thought about it the same way. I think we kind of do that with mental illness. React to that and kind of throw in there, now what can we as the body of Christ, what can we as a church do in this area where we all agree, which is rare for us, this is the second segment, that we all agree there's a problem here. What can we do to address this? We'd like to start off.
Well, it seems to me that this is part of the imperative to care for the sick and those who are marginalised among us, and that is therefore an overriding responsibility of the Christian community. I personally think that the best way to achieve that is through the community more generally, and therefore for the state to provide adequate care. Just harking back to something Elgin was saying, it's not a matter of personal freedom here. The fact is that people who themselves think they should be hospitalised can't actually get into hospital unless they tick a set of boxes which are increasingly hard to tick. So.
Yeah, I was just going to say the only concern, Chris, I have with that, at least in the United States, for instance, the health care that the government is responsible for currently, which is to our veterans, isn't going very well. And the idea that turning the state into those who are trying to provide care in mental health issues, I'm not too confident that they can do it at the level that it could be accomplished in the private sector. And so that would be my only pushback on that. I think it needs to happen how to go about doing it, if it's a partnership between the government and private institutions or whatever that looks like. I just know if you wholesale turn it over to the government, at least here in the United States, they've shown pretty ably that they can't handle what needs to happen. And you can ask just about any veteran about their health care through the VA system, and they'll wholeheartedly echo that sentiment. So
I'm generally very satisfied with our NHS here, which of course is an entirely government-funded system, apart from the fact that mental health is the poor relation in there, and it's suffering cutbacks with the current climate of austerity, which is another issue.
Alan, any final comments before we move on?
Well, you talk about what the body of Christ can do. I would just simply talk about the ministry of presence as we can. I mean, we deal. Again, I'm in a downtown situation. I realize mental illness is not confined to people in downtown, but tomorrow morning we will do what we do every week. We partner with other churches, and in our church we have a worship service and a sermon, music and sermon. The service caters to the poor, to the homeless, and then we feed them breakfast. And most of the people there, of course, do not have serious mental health issues, but there are those who are there, and we're there to offer our presence. It does present somewhat of a risk. We do have some interesting warnings, with potential violence and fisticuffs and other things that we have to be very diligent about. But it's our way, at least it's a small way to say to these folks, you matter to us, we care about you, you matter to us, and we're here for you. And so, again, I just guess my answer to that as far as the body of Christ is do our best to be present to persons who need our assistance, no matter in what way that assistance may be needed.
Okay. Well, there's Michael mentioned the inability of the government to handle the VA problem, and I think that one of the really big issues here is that there seems to be a big difference between the way governments run. One of the problems we have here is that our governments tend to seem to promise more than they actually pay for. And this is a growing problem, and a little bit of that came out this week when Teamsters Union, centralized multi-state organization, sending out notices basically saying they don't have enough money to pay for the retirement that they had been promised to their members, and they're going to have to start cutting their retirement. I know in CalPERS, which is a California state retirement program, they have a close to a $1 trillion shortfall. I used to be $500 billion, but his last few years it's now up to evidently close to $1 trillion in terms of they've promised pensions to these people, but they haven't provided enough money to pay for it, and they're $1 trillion short, which that's a lot of money even for a government. What's going to happen here? We see this not just in those locations, but we see that in a lot of places. Governments have made a lot more promises. The United States government in a whole, we're $18 trillion in debt, and we have a $100 trillion unfunded liability. And our gross national product is only roughly 15 trillion. So, problems are on the horizon. How are we going to deal with that? First off, Chris, do you have those problems in England? I mean, is that something happens to English government?
Indeed it is. There was, for quite a long time, a fashion for final salary pension schemes in government, which were often coupled with the ability to retire incredibly early. And they are costing an awful lot of money. Nobody gets final salary pension provision anymore. Some of it has been addressed in a very few cases by basically reneging on the you can retire early promises for people, though not as far as I'm aware yet in terms of the amount of the pension that's actually received. It's not the threat that it used to be, because government seems to be managing to absorb it along the way here. But yes, it's a problem. Promises were made and they weren't backed up by a suitable amount of money being put on one side. And in particular, as an awful lot of people contributed into that pot on the promise of a particular arrangement, it is very difficult morally to see how government can renege on that.
Michael?
But yeah, I think you have two things in my mind at play. One being just financial literacy among normal everyday people, and I think it can often be pitched in a situation like this, and I've heard it. Go in the military, put your 20 years in. Go into state government, put your 20 years in. Retire, go do what you want to do after that, and you'll have this steady stream of income coming in. And so a lot of people don't really think what their part is to play in planning for the future, and trusting the government to handle it has not turned out too well across the board. And so that'd be one of the areas that I would think we would need to take care of, is educating people. What does it look like to save? What does it look like to prepare for retirement? What can you do personally to make sure that you're ready at that point? In terms of promises made and not kept, I think you got to realize, at least in the situations that you described, that for whatever reason, either it wasn't a good plan to start with, or, which often happens, that money that has been put in consistently is tapped into for other reasons outside of providing pensions that were promised. And so there's got to be some type of safeguards put in place to where projections are made of how much money is going to need to be there in the short term and then in the long term. Some type of regulation that can make sure that the promises that are made are actually kept, and people in those positions who will abide by those. And if that doesn't happen, again, you're gonna see the same thing continuously happen over and over and over again.
Okay, Allan, before you go to you, let me introduce another little factor. 'Cause we've mentioned the moral problem of promising people a pension and then reneging on it, but isn't there also a moral problem, a generational moral problem, where one generation basically sets aside for retirement but then takes that money and spends it on roads or whatever to make their life better, and then leaving the IOUs for the next generation to pick up when they retire? Isn't there also a generational or a moral issue there? Allan, you want to try to address that?
Well, I think there's all kinds of moral issues. I mean, I was thinking as you all were talking, is there a Western democracy in existence that doesn't promise more than it can deliver? I mean, that's the first question that I would ask. I mean, Canada has a $5 billion deficit, which is a drop in the bucket compared to the United States. So we could ask, how are they doing all of that and managing to be more fiscally responsible? Do they have a national health care system, much like Canada, or much like the UK? How do they do all of that? But there are two things. I would certainly echo what Michael said about financial planning and being prepared and not being dependent. I mean, the reality is most of us can live on a lot less than we do, but it takes discipline, and it takes saying no. And I think that, I mean, sometimes when I see the proposed budgets of families, when I look at certain books and budgets, I say, what do you mean $150 a month for clothes? Who spends $150 a month on clothes? I mean, seriously. And if you spend $150 a month on clothes, you've got other issues. So it is possible. We do need to sort of take charge of that. I agree with that. Having said that, yeah, I mean, it's one thing. I mean, you make promises to people, you need to try and keep them. But this is an example of how government overreaches simply because it can. And now it's you know, I mean, no, I mean, I'm sorry, I don't think you should have to have a kind of pension where you can retire at 50, particularly since we're all living longer.
Yeah.
So it's a moral issue. It's a moral issue, and it also it deals with our own self-centeredness and what we want and wanting to have everything that we think we should have.
So, any closing comments before we go on to our final topic?
Well, just to back up your comment about the debts being paid by children, why not quote Ezekiel 18 and say, fathers have eaten sour grapes, but the teeth of the children should not be set on edge. The sins of the fathers in this case are being visited on future generations, and it is clearly wrong.
And I don't really see how we're going to solve it. I mean, I look out and try to plot it out. It doesn't look good. Well, one other area that doesn't look good is the growing unrest in Israel. That's been seems to be a perennial problem, but over the last month and a half, 2 months, there's been a whole series of stabbings and just shootings. It just gets seems to be worse and worse. I noticed that Joseph's tomb was burned. So is there any hope for that area? Who wants to start off with that pleasant topic?
Well, I'm guessing that. I mean, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I'm guessing that I probably will be buried before we see the solution to the problem. I think it's very deeply embedded. I think it's complex. I think there's blame to go around on both sides on this. And then I think there's other factors that don't just include the Israelis and Palestinians, but governments around Israel and just all the special different interests that people have and everything going on. I think it's just very complex. I would love to see some kind of two-state solution really be in place at some point, but at this point, I'm just not expecting to see it.
I also can't see any ready solution, particularly as you cannot make a viable state for the Palestinians and respect all the settlements that the Israelis have built in the West Bank. It's just not practical, and the chances of getting the Israelis to give up all the settlements are, in my view, very low indeed. Yes, I agree with you, Alan. There is plenty of fault on both sides. The problem is we have two populations, both of which, with some legitimacy, say this is my homeland, and I should be able to live there freely. And at the moment, the Palestinians can't live there freely, and the Israelis can't live there without fear. So.
Michael?
Yeah, I don't know that there's much I could add to that other than looking at the situation from the perspective of being able to bring those parties together in some type of meaningful conversation, which has been almost impossible to do. And until I think you can get them to agree to come to the table, I just don't see any potential for moving forward there, which is really a sad spot to be sitting in as well, recognizing that you've got an entire population over there who has no idea whether they may wake up in the morning and get on the bus and there be a suicide bomber or missiles get launched and things like that. It's really it's a terrifying spot to be sitting in for the people that are there, and that's just sad. It really is.
Yeah. Well, we'll be coming back to that more in depth at the at the end of our bottom of the hour break, but we are at the bottom of the hour, and this is a chance, take a little bit of a breather and introduce ourselves and give you a chance to plug any books or websites or articles or whatever that you've got going on. And so again, my name's Elgin Hushbeck, and I've written 4 books. You can get them at my site or at Amazon or anywhere, pretty much. I'll just turn that over to Chris so he can introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Chris Eyre, from the other side of the Atlantic and the other side of politics. I blog at airlines.energian.net. I'm one of the Energian editors, and there may be a book on the Trinity coming out in the not too far distant future.
Good. Allan.
Allan Bevere. I am not from either side of politics. I exist to annoy both sides. And I blog at allanbevere.com, ALLAN, 2 L's, 2 A's, and the books I have there and the books I edit are available there. I'm the pastor of the First United Methodist Church of Akron, Ohio, and I am a professional fellow in theology at Ashland Theological Seminary in Ashland, Ohio.
And Michael.
Yeah, Michael Kennedy, pastor at Crosspoint Community Church in Dublin, Georgia. Just put out a book with Nergion called Parent Driven Discipleship. And my website is Michael F. Kennedy Jr. at wordpress.com.
Okay. I guess I should also mention that the Energion Discussion Network, which is energion.co/discuss, and I have 2 articles up currently this week, and 1 more going up on Monday that you might want to check out. The 2 that are up already are on, the first one's on inerrancy and why I don't argue for it very much, which is sort of a strange take for me. And the second one is on why apologetics. So you might want to check out both of those. And then I've got hopefully an interesting one coming up on Monday, which is a little bit more political, but it deals with the concept of legalism. So you might want to check that one out as well. Let's go back to the discussion. Chris, I want to pick up on something you said. You said you were reluctant to, or you were doubtful that the Israelis would give up their settlements in the West Bank. I'm kind of curious as to why you've said that, because the Israelis have repeatedly shown a willingness to trade land for peace, and in the process have removed settlements. So when they left Sinai, they bulldozed their settlements there and forcibly removed their people. When they left Gaza, likewise, they didn't bulldoze the settlements, they left them. They were bulldozed by the Palestinians after they left. But again, they forcibly removed their people out of those settlements. And so why would you think that they wouldn't do the same thing if given the chance in the West Bank?
Right. Firstly, nothing I've seen from the Israelis recently indicates to me that they're still willing to remove settlements. On the contrary, everything I've seen indicates that they've been, if not overtly, then tacitly supporting extra settlements in a lot of places and the expropriation of Palestinian land. There are now so many settlers on the West Bank that I am very dubious that the Israeli government could maintain a mandate while having a policy of removing all of the West Bank settlements, which is what I think would basically be needed, unless there was some extreme pressure that was obvious. I will say that the one form of extreme pressure I can see that might be applied is in the hands of the United States, which is withdrawing all funding from the Israeli government, which I would encourage them to do.
Well, let me say that I see this as a not a completely black and white situation. There's no such thing, and there is some fault on both sides, but primarily to me, in fact, very lopsidedly, I blame the Palestinians. Simply because before there were settlements, there was conflict. going back to, when Israel was established in 1947, the next morning, Arab nations around them invaded. And they've invaded, so year after year, there have been wars and conflicts. The last going up until recently, when President Clinton had Arafat over, and they basically gave them, 97, 98% of everything they asked for in terms of land and offsets for the land that they wanted to retain for security reasons. Arafat said no, wouldn't even give a counterproposal, and started the Intifada. So I think the primary problem is the fact that the Palestinians will not settle for anything but the annihilation of the Jews, and until they're at least willing to allow a state, then you will not get peace there. Where am I going wrong? So,
I really have to disagree that the Palestinians were responsible for instituting the hostilities, because before the start of the Israeli state, there were Jewish organizations going around intimidating Palestinians, clearing them out of their houses, causing a refugee problem, and to a great extent it was that to which the surrounding Arab nations, out of solidarity, responded with the invasion. I think that was an entirely misguided action. But a lot of the Palestinian population was displaced in that period, and I look at what I would be feeling about things if some ostensibly foreign people arrived in my area, said it was their ancestral land and I should get out, intimidated me, and then said I've no right to claim it back. And I would probably feel that force was not an entirely unreasonable way to claim it back.
So, Allan, where do you fit on the spectrum?
Oh, well, it seems to me that we have to assess where we are now. We have got a state called Israel over there. We have got two territories that at some point we would hope that there could be a two-state solution. And I mean, the only way we're going to get to that is for people on both sides to be serious enough to have that discussion, be willing to give and compromise, so that finally you can have a two-state situation. Now, I do understand that there are those who would like to see Israel not exist. I mean, I think to say the Palestinians don't want them to exist is a pretty sweeping generalization. But I have no doubt that there are people there who would like to see, would do not want to coexist with Israel, but I think those are the people that just need to be marginalized, and to bring the serious players to the table. Now, that's easier said than done.
Michael.
Yeah, I think you're going to have to be creative enough to figure out a way to bring the two parties together, to have that conversation, like Allan had mentioned. The only hope that I see in that is possibly recently news came out that there was oil discovered in Israel that possibly could be a game-changing situation there. And I just wonder if there's a possibility of bringing both sides to the table over something like that. one of the major issues that Palestinians are facing that are within that area is high unemployment rate, and even those that are employed, pay rate is anywhere from 20 to 40% less than what Israelis are paid. So I think if you could be creative enough to bring the two parties together, making some promises, whether you distribute out based on the company that's going to take over the oil exploration and things like that, to distribute among all the Israelis and Palestinians shares of that company, to almost a oil for peace type situation, to that they all have a vested interest in a safe location. They all have a vested interest in the economic prosperity of the region. I think that may be a potential to bring the two sides together. But unless you have something like that, I just think it ends up being the Republicans and the Democrats shouting over one another, like we're experiencing now in the Congress. And so I just don't see I don't see how you're going to do it without something happening like that to bring them to the table.
That's an interesting comment you make, Michael. When you were saying that, it reminded me of Robert McNamara, who was John F. Kennedy's Secretary of State, and when they were having discussions back there in the 60s about how to encourage democracy in South American countries, McNamara said that if you give most people the choice between a little more freedom and a brand new car, they probably would take the car. So the point was, give them common economic interests, give them an opportunity to prosper a little bit, and once they have that and share that, they can come together. I mean, again, it's a thought worth exploring. But and the other thing let me say real quickly, one other thing is that we made the situation worse back when George Bush was president, and who had a democracy fetish and insisted that the Palestinians elect their leaders. And who'd they elect? Hamas. I mean, that really complicated the situation.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I say the Palestinians, the polls I've seen show it's roughly anywhere from 70 to 80% of the Palestinians want Israel gone completely. They're not interested in a two-state solution. And I think to me, that's the fundamental problem. Yeah, there were refugees. There were refugees from Palestine, but there were over 1 million Jewish refugees from other Arab states in 1947. So the difference is the Arab states left their Palestinians in refugee camps, and the Jewish state absorbed their refugees into the society. And that's, I also find it unique that there were two states created in 1940, actually 4 states, or 3, depending on how you want to do the math, in 1947, right? And we always talk about Palestine and Israel, but is there really that much debate over the fact that we carved out Pakistan out of India and created a state there? And to me, Pakistan is just as legitimate as Israel is, but we don't. How many movements are there to move Pakistan back into India and to get rid of the state of Pakistan? And I think the problem is until the Palestinians are willing to allow a Jewish state, you will not get a solution there.
And I think their pushback on it would be in allowing a Jewish state, they're basically taking on the role of being subservient in every single way in that situation, just based on the fact that there's nothing for them to prosper where they are, which takes me back to what we said and the comments that you made about the stats showing that majority of Palestinians want to wipe the Israelis off the map. But I wonder if you went to each of them individually and said, yeah, but we have this option. You can continue on the way you're going, or we can can make you a millionaire. Would you rather be a millionaire in a safe place, or would you rather continue going through this process that you're going through right now? And I would be willing to bet that they'd be good, as Allan said, with a new car, and the opportunity to prosper versus where they sit right now.
I'm not sure on that. And you think about the Oslo Accords going back into the 90s were essentially to move us to the two-state solution. And eventually, the reason they pulled out of Gaza and left Gaza completely to the Palestinians was because that was supposed to be the nascent Palestinian state. They were supposed to be able to show they could rule themselves. And the Western governments poured billions of dollars into Palestine, which went basically to line the pockets of their leaders and to buy rockets to shell Israel with.
Oh, come. I mean, Gaza has no chance of being an independent state. It has no natural resources, precious little farmland, and a population probably 10 to 20 times what it might just possibly naturally support. The West Bank's the area where the agriculture is, and about half of that has been appropriated. I do think, though, that taking into account something said earlier, there is a lot of blame to go round elsewhere than locally. My country can take a lot of blame for basically managing, in the course of trying to win 2 world wars, promising the same bit of country on the one hand to Jews and on the other hand to Arabs, and you can't get around that. The Jordanians and the Egyptians can be faulted for basically saying, in Jordan's case, no, the West Bank's nothing to do with us, we don't want it, and in Egypt's case, Gaza. The more natural solution at that point would have been for the refugees in both cases to be absorbed into those countries, though Jordan would have been overwhelmed because of the number that had been displaced from what is now Israel into the West Bank in the first place. Obviously, there are a lot of players who can find some responsibility there, but I think Michael and Allan are right. What we need to do is, from where we are at the moment, try to find some way forward. I'd like to hope that Michael's right and that the application of sufficient money might just be something which would provide a solution. There is the slight snag that I have no idea where that money is coming from, both of our countries having significant deficits at the moment.
Yeah, my thought on where the money would come from, it would have to be set up within some type of corporation that was overseeing the oil exploration and eventual refining and all that kind of stuff. So, it would be through that, whether you distribute equally among the Israelis and the Palestinians shares within that company, or how you do that. What's interesting is, currently the company that is working to drill and try to discover that there were oil reserves there, and what you have there is a lot of U.S. businessmen who have invested in that company, and who have, in their minds, a vested interest in what's going on there. If you could bring many of them to the table, and afford them the opportunity to work together instead of hoarding the wealth that is probably going to end up being created again, by guys like George Soros, and Dick Cheney, I think, is involved in that company as well as an investor. But if you can convince them to be able to take those shares that they own, to be able to distribute those out, so that there again is the chance for prosperity for Israelis and Palestinians together through something like this, I think that that may be a possibility. So
there is a model for that. The state of Alaska, for example, all the oil drilling up on the North Shore, they effectively, even in Alaska, you don't so much pay taxes as get a check from the government because of all the oil resources. So there is already a pre-existing model for that. Allan, did you want to jump in here?
No, I think what's been said is sufficient, and I'm sure at some point we'll be talking about this again.
I will.
Yeah, I just don't know. I agree. In some extent, I think we are in agreement that you need to get the sides together, and I think probably some sort of two-state solution is probably what you need to get to. I just don't see how you get there until you get an acceptance that Israel can be one of the two states. That to me seems to be the core problem.
I think it's probably worth mentioning that there is an idea which I don't think has been explored here, and that is of a bipartite single state, with one side being Palestinian, the other side being Israeli, but the two being in some ways one, which might allow for some more flexibility in terms of the Jewish state being fundamentally a single religion state. I know it isn't in practice, but it's certainly aimed at being a single ethnicity state to a great extent. There is a model for that in Belgium, which is bipartite between the Flemish speakers and the French speakers. I will admit they don't get on marvellously well, but they do get on a heck of a lot better than the Israelis and the Palestinians, and it has managed to survive quite a while now. If you're talking about natural resources that might benefit both sides, it does seem to me that there is just a possibility that with a strong enough constitution, something like that, which is slightly out of the box as far as what I can see that's been discussed is concerned, something like that might just be able to work.
I mean,
there are Jewish. I mean, they're Jewish. We think Israel is a Jewish state, but there are Palestinians, Arabs in Israel that they vote. They live there. They're elected to parliament. They work as teachers and doctors. They have judges. And they're an integral part of the state. They're not a majority part of the state, but they live there and they're a part of the state. So it's they're much more open, Israel is, to having Arabs as part of their community and part of their system as the Palestinians are to allowing Jews to be part of their system. I just don't, as far as natural resources, if you look at, I think there are solutions there. If nothing else, they've got some fairly nice beaches. They could be a resort community. Obviously, nobody wants to vacation in Gaza at the moment.
That's right.
But you have the same problem up in Lebanon. Lebanon used to be the Garden State. Yeah, the Garden State. It was the model of how Arabs and Christians and Jews could all live together, and and the PLO went in the 1970s, and where we're at now. So there is a possibility of setting up something, but it needs people to actually work together on both sides. And again, I go back to the Jews have repeatedly shown a willingness to trade land for peace, be it with Israel, be it whatever. They have taken those. With Egypt. They have taken those steps. I just don't see any movement on the other side.
I'll just say this. might as well throw everything creatively we can think of to try to solve the situation, because it's pretty evident that what's been tried up until this point hasn't worked out too well. You know, you would think, at least I would think, that there ought to be enough wisdom, not only there but within the world community, that could sit down and hammer something out that would be acceptable on both sides of the situation. Or, and again, this maybe playing devil's advocate, maybe that those players involved really don't want peace there, because it affords them opportunities to profit handsomely off of various industries, to make a lot of money off fear and weaponry and things like that. And so if that is gone, there may be the potential there that they have no longer the resources they thought were coming in. So there may be a desire to keep the situation as is.
Well, I would say one of my fundamental theorems is that war only takes one side, peace takes two. So it's always more difficult to have war, and like I keep coming back to, I think we've seen for decades at the minimum, the world focusing on this. The world all agrees you need a two-state solution. I think the reluctance has been with the Palestinians, until they accept. Hamas still has their charter, the destruction of Israel, and they are now the elected government in Palestine. How do you reach a two-state solution when one of the states won't accept the existence of the other? And until that fundamental problem is solved, I don't see how you're going to solve the Middle East issue.
I think perhaps there is some of the answer if you allied Michael's comments with mine. When I said, where do we find the pot of money, there is very significant aid going to Israel at the moment. I'm sure that manipulation of that aid would be a very large financial inducement. The one thing I would point out, though, is that there may seem to be some urgency in this at the moment, because unless someone stops Islamic State, Israel's problem is going to be Islamic State rather than the Palestinians.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that.
There's a principle in Islam that, whether it's directly stated or informally stated, that any land that Islam has controlled for a certain amount of time must always be part of Islam. And you see that not only in Israel, you see that in claims to retake Spain and retake parts of Eastern Europe and things like that. So I mean, but that takes us back into a whole other issue of the problem we have in general with Islam, and or at least let me clarify the more radical fundamentalist aspects of Islam. I think there's plenty of Muslims who are willing to live in a modern pluralistic world and side by side with their non-Muslim neighbors. Unfortunately, there's such a large population that even 10% of those who won't ends up with 100 million people. And that's kind of where we're at today. But we are about out of time for this discussion. Didn't quite settle all the world's issues, but I hope you will join us again next week as we tackle a whole new set of issues that are in the news. And again, I'm Elgin Hushbeck with Chris Eyre, Allan Bevere, and Michael Kennedy, and we thank you for joining us. Be sure to check out the Energeon Discuss Network and also the other events on the Energeon channel. Thank you for joining us. Good night.
Good night.